voice cut clean through the room. "All rise for the Honourable Justice Whitmore." I stood up from behind the bench, smoothed my robe, and looked out at the courtroom. 40, maybe 50 people. Lawyers shuffling papers. A court reporter with her fingers already poised. And in the third row on the left, 2 people I hadn't seen in 27 years. My mother and my father, sitting with a lawyer between them, looking like they'd already won. They didn't recognize me. Of course they didn't. The last time they saw me, I was 7 years old and standing alone in the arrivals hall of Edmonton International Airport, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear missing, watching their backs disappear through a set of glass doors. I want to tell you this story the right way, not the way I've told it to therapists, or to my adoptive father in the kitchen late at night, or to my best friend over wine. I want to tell it the way it actually happened. Messy and slow, and then, somehow, all at once. I was born in Red Deer, Alberta. My parents, I'll call them my biological mother and father because they stopped being anything else a long time ago, were young when they had me. My mother was 22. My father was 25. From what I've pieced together over the years, they were already in trouble before I could walk. Debt. Bad decisions. A rental property deal that collapsed. My father had a habit of chasing money and losing it, and my mother had a habit of following him wherever he pointed. I don't have many memories of that time. I remember a yellow kitchen. I remember my father's laugh, which was big and sudden, the kind that fills a room. I remember my mother's perfume, something floral, too sweet. I remember being happy, the way children are happy before they understand that happiness is conditional. The trip to Edmonton was supposed to be a vacation. That's what they told me. We were going to visit someone. I packed my backpack myself. I remember being proud of that. I put in this stuffed rabbit, a coloring book, 3 crayons, and a granola bar I'd saved from breakfast. We took a taxi to the airport. My mother held my hand the whole way. I remember that specifically because she wasn't usually a handholder. Inside the terminal, we went to the arrivals level, not departures, arrivals, which I thought was strange even then, though I didn't know the word for why. My father pointed to a row of plastic seats bolted to the floor near the baggage carousel and said, "Sit here and wait. We're going to get some food." He said it casually, like it was nothing. My mother looked at me once, just once, then she turned and walked away with him. I sat down. I waited. I counted the bags on the carousel because I was bored and because I thought if I was good, if I was patient and quiet and didn't make a fuss, they'd come back faster. They didn't come back. An hour passed, maybe more. I know because the carousel emptied and filled again with different bags from a different flight. A woman in a green vest asked me where my parents were, and I said they went to get food. She nodded and walked away. Then a man sat down next to me. He was older, late 50s, I guess now, though he seemed ancient to me then. He was wearing a tan jacket and reading a folded newspaper. After a few minutes, he looked over and said, "You've been sitting here a while. Are you waiting for someone?" "My mom and dad," I said. "They went to get food." He nodded slowly. He didn't push. He just folded his newspaper and set it on his knee and said, "I'll wait with you for a bit then." His name was Arthur Whitmore. He stayed with me for 2 hours. He bought me a juice box from a vending machine and a package of crackers. He asked me my name. I told him it was Celia. And he told me about his drive from Camrose, about how he'd come to pick up a friend who'd missed his connecting flight, about how the prairies looked in October. He talked to me like I was a person, not a problem to be managed. When the airport security officer finally came and crouched down in front of me and asked me where my parents were, I started crying. Not because I was scared exactly. I think I already knew they weren't coming back. I think some part of me had known for a while. Arthur stayed until the police arrived. He gave them his name and his number and said he'd be available if they needed him. Then he crouched down next to me, looked me in the eye, and said, "You're going to be okay, Celia, I promise." I held on to that promise for years, even when I had no logical reason to. The next few months are a blur of faces and paperwork. A children's aid worker named Miss Pemberton, who smelled like coffee and wore the same cardigan 3 days in a row. A foster home in Sherwood Park where the family was kind but overwhelmed. A series of hearings in a courthouse that felt enormous and cold. My biological parents had, by then, left the province. What I found out later, much later, when I was old enough to go digging, was that they had collected on a life insurance policy. Apparently, when the investigation into my disappearance began, they told the insurer that I had died in an accident. They fabricated documents. They collected close to $200,000. Then they moved to Ontario and started over. They had another child, a daughter. She was born about 18 months after they abandoned me. I've thought about her a lot over the years, whether she knew, whether they were different with her, whether she ever heard my name. Arthur Whitmore called Miss Pemberton about 6 weeks after the airport. He asked how I was doing. Then he called again. And again. The caseworker later told me she'd never seen anything like it. A stranger, no connection to the family, just a man who'd sat with a child in an airport and couldn't let it go. He applied to be my foster care. It took 8 months. There was an assessment, a home study, background checks, interviews. He was a widower. His wife had passed 2 years earlier. He had a daughter of his own, grown and living in Vancouver. He had a farmhouse property near Camrose and a modest pension from 30 years working as a land surveyor. They approved him. I moved in on a Saturday in June. He put a new purple bedspread on the bed in the spare room. He bought cereal I'd mentioned, liking once in an interview with a caseworker. He'd set up a small bookshelf with picture books, even though I was already starting to outgrow them, because he wasn't sure. I cried for the first 3 nights. He didn't push. He just left the hall light on. By the end of that first summer, I called him Dad. He never asked me to. It just came out one afternoon when he was teaching me to ride a bike on the gravel lane behind the house. And I called out, "Dad, look," before I even realized I'd done it. He stopped walking and stood very still for a moment. Then he smiled, not his usual small smile, but something bigger and quieter at the same time, and said, "I'm looking." He formally adopted me 2 years later. I became Celia Whitmore. Growing up with Arthur was not dramatic. That's what I want people to understand. There were no grand gestures, no speeches, no moments that would translate well to a highlight reel. There were Saturday mornings making pancakes with too much butter. There were drives into Edmonton for school supplies and dentist appointments. There were nights when I had nightmares, and he'd sit in the chair by my bed and read out loud from whatever book I pointed to until I fell back asleep. He taught me to drive in an empty parking lot in Camrose. He drove 4 hours round trip to watch me in every single one of my high school debate competitions. When I got into the University of Alberta's law program, he framed the acceptance letter and hung it in the hallway. He was not a man of many words, but every word he said, he meant. I won't walk you through all of law school, all of the ear tickling, all of the years building toward the bench. That's its own long story, and not the one you're here for. What matters is that Arthur was there for every step of it. He was in the gallery when I was called to the bar. He sent cards, handwritten, on heavy cream paper, on every anniversary that mattered, including every October, the month he'd found me in the airport. He never forgot. He got sick in the spring 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer. He was 81, and by that point I was already a justice of the Alberta Court of Queen's Bench, which I know sounds impossibly tidy but is simply what happened. He knew. He was proud in that quiet way of his. He sent a card to my clerk when I was appointed. He passed in September. I sat with him for the last 2 days in the farmhouse, in the room with the window that looked out over the fields. Before he lost consciousness, he held my hand and said, "You turned out wonderfully." I told him that was entirely his fault. He laughed. It was his last real laugh. I'll keep it forever. The reading of the will happened in a lawyer's office in Camrose on a Thursday in November, 3 weeks after the funeral. I was expecting the house, maybe. A modest amount in savings. Arthur had always lived carefully, spent thoughtfully, and never talked about money in ways that suggested there was much of it. I was wrong. It turns out Arthur had quietly, over decades, invested with discipline and patience. The farmland had tripled in value. There were accounts I knew nothing about. The total estate came to just under $4 million. He left the house and the land to his biological daughter in Vancouver, which I understood completely and had no feelings about. He left a significant donation to the Children's Aid Society that had processed my original case. And he left the remainder, just over $2.8 million, to me. His lawyer read the accompanying note out loud. It said, "She sat with all that uncertainty and she never stopped being kind. This is not charity. This is the most overdue debt I've ever tried to repay." I held it together until I got to my car. Then I sat in the parking lot for 45 minutes and cried so hard I couldn't see. I had been a justice for 3 years at that point. I had presided over civil cases, family law disputes, estate litigation. I was not naive about what money does to people who feel they have a claim to it. I was still surprised when the letter arrived. It came through a law firm in Mississauga, Ontario. The letterhead was professional, the language careful. My biological parents, and yes, their names were on the documents. Names I hadn't seen in writing since childhood, were filing a claim against the estate of Arthur Whitmore. The position, laid out in 7 dense paragraphs, was that as my biological next of kin, they had a superior claim to any inheritance left to me. They were citing an obscure provision related to a surviving parent's rights. They were also in a separate filing, challenging the validity of my adoption on a procedural technicality they claimed had never been properly resolved. They were suing for the full $2.8 million. I read the letter standing at my kitchen counter at 7 in the morning in my bathrobe, and the first thing I felt was not rage. It was something colder and stranger than that. It was a kind of recognition. This is exactly the move that kind of person makes. The second thing I felt was that I needed a very good lawyer. I recused myself from the file immediately and disclosed the conflict to the Chief Justice's office. That's not optional. It's the only ethical thing to do. I retained a litigation firm out of Calgary, a woman named Sandra Lau, who I'd watched argue cases for years and who had a particular gift for making the opposing side's arguments sound as thin as they actually were. The case was assigned to a colleague of mine. I won't name her here. She's excellent and has nothing to do with any of this other than doing her job fairly. The hearing was set for late January. I attended as a party to the proceedings, not as a justice. I sat at the respondent's table in civilian clothes, a dark blazer, gray trousers, feeling the strange dislocation of being on the other side of a proceeding. My biological parents were already seated when I arrived. They were in their late 50s now, a little heavier, a little grayer. My biological father was wearing a navy suit that was slightly too large for him. My biological mother had her hair cut short. Their lawyer was young, mid-30s, eager-looking. They didn't recognize me. I knew they wouldn't. I was 7 the last time they saw me. I'm 34 now, and I look nothing like the child I was. But I still found myself watching them, watching the room, scanning for the woman they expected to see. Someone, presumably, who looked frightened or uncertain or easy to steamroll. And I felt something settle in me like a door closing quietly on a latch. Sandra was brilliant. She walked the court through the timeline with precision, the abandonment, the police report from 1997, the fraudulent insurance claim, which, once surfaced, took on a life of its own in the proceeding, the valid adoption order, the decades of no contact. She called a records specialist from the Edmonton airport who had located the original 1997 security log. She called Arthur's former lawyer, who testified to the decade-long process by which Arthur had sought and obtained legal guardianship, then full adoption. Then she called my biological mother's other daughter to testify. This is the part that still catches in my chest when I think about it. She was 26. She drove up from Toronto. She sat in the witness box in a yellow coat, and she told the court that she had found documents in their parents' home when she was 19, a file folder at the back of a closet, and that those documents included what appeared to be an original insurance claim form, a death certificate for a child named Celia, and a settlement check stub for $197,500. She said she had confronted her parents and her father had told her it was old business, nothing to do with you. She said she had not been able to stop thinking about it for 7 years. She said, "I came here because it's the right thing to do, that's all." I had to look at the wall for a moment after she finished. The ruling came 12 days later. The claim was dismissed in its entirety. The adoption was confirmed valid. My inheritance from Arthur's estate was upheld. The judge, my colleague, whom I have enormous respect for, also noted in her written reasons that the fraudulent insurance documentation submitted by the claimants had been referred to the RCMP for investigation. My biological parents were ordered to pay full costs. I was standing in Sandra's office when we got the call. I thanked her. I sat down in the chair across from her desk, and I said, "What do I do now?" Sandra looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Whatever you want." What I did was this. I took a leave from the bench, a short one, 3 months, and I did what I'd been quietly planning since the estate settled. I set up a foundation. I called it the Arrivals Foundation because that word felt right. Arriving, being received, being somewhere you're meant to be. The Arrivals Foundation funds legal representation for children in foster care proceedings across Alberta. Kids who are old enough to have a voice in their own cases but who, without counsel, have no way to use it. Kids sitting in proceedings that will determine the rest of their lives in rooms full of adults with no one there specifically for them. Arthur had spent 30 years of his retirement savings to give me a life. The least I could do was pass some of that forward. I went back to the bench in April. The first case I presided over after my return was a routine property dispute, completely unremarkable, and I loved every minute of it. I still have the stuffed rabbit. 1 ear is still missing. It sits on the bookshelf in my home office between a photo of Arthur at my bar call and my first ever gavel, a gift from my clerk when I was appointed. Some things you carry because they're too heavy to put down. Some things you carry because putting them down would mean forgetting where you started, and you don't want to forget. You want to remember exactly what it felt like to be 7 years old in an airport with a granola bar in your backpack, waiting for people who were never coming back, so that you can also remember the man who sat down next to you and said he'd wait for a bit. I thought a lot about whether what happened in that courtroom was justice or just luck, whether I was lucky to have been found by someone like Arthur, or whether Arthur was the inevitable outcome of being the kind of child who sat quietly and didn't cause a fuss, and therefore gave a kind man the time and space to notice her. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure it matters. What matters is that a 7-year-old girl sat in an airport with 1 ear missing from her stuffed rabbit, and the world sent her someone good. And that girl, eventually, after a lot of years and a lot of hard work and one very well-argued court filing, sat at the front of a different room in a different city and watched the people who had tried to erase her discover that they were too late. I was already here. I had been here for a long time. I've been thinking about what it actually takes to survive something like this. Not just the abandonment, not just the courtroom, but the whole long arc of it. What it takes to go from a 7-year-old sitting alone under fluorescent airport lights to a woman who can sit at the front of a room and not flinch. I don't think it was one thing. I think it was 3 things, working quietly together over 27 years. The first was Arthur, not his money, his decency. He sat down next to a child he didn't know and chose to stay. That one act of basic moral integrity set everything else in motion. I've thought about this often, what my life looks like if Arthur walks past instead of sitting down. The answer is that I genuinely don't know, and that uncertainty is enough to make me take the idea of showing up for people seriously. What we owe each other, as strangers, as neighbors, as human beings moving through shared spaces, is more consequential than we usually let ourselves believe. Arthur knew that. He lived it without making a speech about it. The rightness of what he did returned to him, not as a reward exactly, but as a life that had meaning, a daughter, a foundation, a legacy that outlasted him. The second thing was that I never stopped trying to understand the world I was moving through. Law school was hard. The articling years were harder. There were moments when the gap between where I'd started and where I was trying to get felt unbridgeable. But I kept reading, kept asking questions, kept choosing to understand the systems around me rather than be flattened by them. That knowledge, practical, hard-won, sometimes boring, is what let me walk into a courtroom as a party to a case and know exactly what my rights were. The people who tried to take what Arthur left me were counting on me not knowing. They were wrong. The third thing is harder to name. It's the quality that gets you through the nights when you're 7, and the hall light is the only thing standing between you and complete darkness. It's what makes you call a grown man dad when you didn't know you were going to, because something in you needed to claim that relationship out loud. It's what makes you set up a foundation instead of just cashing the check and moving on. I think of it as a kind of refusal. A refusal to let what happened to you become the final word on who you are. My biological parents made a decision about my worth when I was 7 years old. I spent the next 27 years quietly proving them wrong, not out of spite, but because I genuinely had somewhere to be. The court didn't give me anything I hadn't already built. It just confirmed what Arthur had known since he folded his newspaper on that plastic airport bench and decided to stay. What I carry forward is not bitterness. It's something more useful than that. It's the knowledge that how you treat people, a child, a stranger, someone with nothing, echoes forward in ways you cannot predict and cannot take back. Arthur knew that. His sister knew it when she drove up from Toronto in a yellow coat to tell the truth. Sandra knew it every time she stood up and spoke. I know it now too. The stuffed rabbit is still on my shelf. One ear still missing. I'm not sure I'll ever fix it.